The Fresh Fiction Podcast is brought to you by REVELL Books in Bethany House, publishers of The Sound of Distant Thunder by Jan Drexler. Jan stopped by today to talk to me about this new book, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. Welcome to Season 2 of the Fresh Fiction Podcast. And welcome back to the Fresh Fiction Podcast. And now I am joined by Jan Drexler, who is the author of the new book, The Sound of Distant Thunder. Jan, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, I am so excited. I have a little place in my heart for Amish stories, so I'm really looking forward to talking about The Sound of Distant Thunder. First, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners?
I came to writing a little bit later in my life. My first career was that as a homeschool mom, and it was a career that I loved, but it has an ending point. You know, when your youngest child graduates, then you're out of a job.
Right.
So I had always wanted to write. It was a dream that I kind of pushed to the background while my children were growing up. But when my youngest got into high school, I started looking at what I was going to be doing after they graduated, and I thought about going back to school and getting a degree for teaching or library science or something like that, because I'm interested in all those things. Mm-hmm. But my husband encouraged me to try writing, and I said, okay, I'll give it 3 years. If I don't sell something in 3 years, then I'll do something else. Well, I actually sold the first book I wrote.
Wow.
Which is very unusual.
Right.
And within 3 years, I had my first book contract. So I haven't looked back since then.
That's
I just
cool.
keep writing the ideas that God gives me.
Did you have a lot of hard time with that first book, or did it kind of just come to you?
It came pretty naturally. I say it was my first book, but I had spent the previous 12 to 14 years learning. When you're a homeschool mom, you're not just throwing things at your kids, you're learning along with them.
Right.
And we did a classical education, and I learned a lot about history and logic and rhetoric and how to write. And we did a wonderful course when my boys were in high school called the One-Year Adventure Novel. Mm-hmm. And that really helped me solidify in my mind what I had learned in college about writing. And that was really the starting point of being able to do that. So when I got to writing my novel, it came fairly easily because of all the background that I had.
Yeah. And so, because you've always done, at least I'm looking at your background, you've always done these Amish stories. What's your background with Amish?
Well, my great-great-grandfather was Amish when he lived in Ohio, and that side of the family was all Amish. But when he moved to Indiana, he moved to an area where there weren't any other Amish, and he joined a German Baptist Brethren church. And I had grown up knowing that our ancestors were Amish, but my foray into learning about the Amish was kind of trying to figure out why weren't we Amish anymore. Mm-hmm. Where did that split come? And it was that grandfather who joined the Brethren Church, and that's where most of my family is now, is in the Brethren Church. But I've always had this heart for the Amish. I remember visiting my grandmother when I was growing up, and she would point out, the Amish horses and buggies and so on in her little town in northern Indiana. And she would say, well, our ancestors drove horses and buggies just like that because we were Amish. And that sparked the curiosity.
Sure, absolutely. And I bet it's always so wonderful to go to these areas that still are inhabited by Amish groups and families, because it always feels like you're taking a big step back in time.
Yes, it is. And my dad still lives in that area in northern Indiana, and we go to visit him a couple times a year. And going to Shipshewana and Middlebury and all these other Amish tourist places, it's like going home for me.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's such a comforting place. My family's from Lancaster County, so we do the same thing every couple of years. We go up and visit and see where our people came from, which is really cool. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's neat to have that sort of very American experience.
Yes.
So
yes. And a unique one.
Yeah, a very unique one. It's something that keeps it. I don't know. I always find it to be like a really nice heart of our American culture. So it's great to see so many books that are kind of tapping into that as well. Mm-hmm. I'm very fascinated. I want to go back to a thing you said about the class that you did with your boys when they were in high school. About did you guys have to write a novel in a year? Was that sort of the goal of that class?
That was. It was the name of the course is the 1-year adventure novel, mm-hmm. and you can find it online by searching for that. It was a course that went through the school year, and by the end of the course, you had written a novel. It was not a very long novel,
sure,
and it was a rough draft, but we had a lot of fun with it. And yes, all three of us did write a novel.
That's so cool. That's what I was going to ask. I was like, yeah, because I think you brought up a really great point, which is when you are the teacher, you're always learning as well, and so that's a really cool experience to get. Had that been the first time you had tried writing a novel since maybe you were in college?
Yes, when I was in college, I focused more on poetry and short stories. And so this was the first time that I actually thought of something longer and what writing a novel takes, mm-hmm. as far as sustaining the story throughout the entire length of the work.
Jumping over to your first series, The Journey to Pleasant Prairie, mm-hmm. with Hannah's Choice, so that was your first novel that you wrote?
No, my first novel was actually The Prodigal Son Returns, that was published by Love Inspired Historical.
Gotcha.
And it was in May of 2013 is when that came out.
Wow, so you really are just a little writer baby.
Yeah. But
have you been able to find
when you don't have little children around?
That is true. I was going to say there's not as many distractions. You get to kind of set your own schedule. Do you start your day writing, or do you find yourself writing later in the day?
Well, on a normal day, I get up about 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and I start out with Bible reading, Bible study. And then I have 2 dogs that have to be fed and taken out,
of course,
walked and so on.
Very bossy.
And then and then there's breakfast, of course. But then I spend about an hour on the computer on social media, where I read a couple blogs every day, and there are, of course, I put things on Facebook and Goodreads and those kinds of things. But then about 8:30 or 9 o'clock is when I really settle down to start writing. And I try to write for a couple hours in the morning, take about an hour for lunch, and then I write a couple hours in the afternoon.
Oh, nice.
And then I save an hour at the end of the afternoon because I'm tired. Mm-hmm. Writing is mentally exhausting.
It is very much.
But I save an hour or so to do research. As I'm writing, questions will come up, and I'll just jot them down, and then I'll look them up during that last hour. Or maybe I have a blog post that I need to be working on, and I'll work on that then.
When you started writing, and probably maybe a little bit now, do you have a good writers community around you?
Yes. When I first started, my writing community was online. Mm-hmm. We were in the process of moving from Kansas to South Dakota, and so I didn't connect with the writers in Kansas because we were leaving.
Right.
And when I got to South Dakota, I didn't find a writers community here. We have formed one now. I found other writers, and we have formed a branch of the ACFW, our own little. We're part of the larger Dakota's ACFW chapter.
Yeah.
But we meet the last Friday of the month, so we have a meeting this morning.
Oh man, which
will be a lot of fun.
Oh, good. I bet I always imagine when you get a bunch of writers together that it's like 80% good time, and then the rest of the 20% is like, okay, guys, we actually have to do some work today.
But it's a lot of support too, because writing is such a internal thing mm-hmm. to do, and we are not social people. Writers usually aren't. And so to get together with other people who speak your own language is wonderful. And the online communities are so valuable, too. I belong to Seekerville, there are 14 of us authors, and we have a blog that we add to at least 3 times a week, sometimes 4 or 5 times a week.
Oh, wow.
And that is a real community. We have discussions in the comment section of the blogs where we discuss the topic at hand or pray for each other or whatever we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always so great. Well, switching gears a little bit, let's we want to make sure we talk about the newest novel, and you're starting a brand new series with this. So the Amish Weavers Creek series, this is your second series that you've done, correct?
Yes, the second series with REVELL,
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about The Sound of Distant Thunder.
Well, it starts at the beginning of the Civil War. Actually, the war's been going on for about 9 months to a year when the story opens. And it's affecting this little Amish community that I created in my mind in Holmes County, Ohio. And specifically Jonas, who's the hero of the story. He's a young man. He has not yet joined the church, which means that he is not held to the same standards as someone who has joined the church.
Right.
So he's interested in the abolitionist movement, which was very strong then, and he is kind of, you know how it is when you're young. You kind of play with these ideas that would be forbidden otherwise. So he's kind of playing with this idea of what if he fought in the war? What if he fought to help free the slaves, which is his goal. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he is in love with his neighbor, Katie, who is another year or 2 younger than he is, and they're planning on getting married. And so he's building a house and building for his future and puts away these ideas of going to war. But then Ohio, which is where they're living, instituted a statewide draft early in the war because they weren't getting enough volunteers. Mm-hmm. And his brother's name comes up in the draft. And his brother is older, a member of the church, has a family, and the Amish have been given the option to hire someone to take their place. But Samuel, Jonas's brother, doesn't feel that is good either. He doesn't want to hire someone and send them off to war. So Samuel doesn't know what he's going to do. He's kind of stuck. And then so Jonas decides he will go to war in his brother's place. And so there's the rest of the story then is about his experiences in the war and also his relationship with Katie. Mm-hmm. And his family left behind. How is this going to affect his future as an Amish person? Yeah. And, how is he going to even survive the war?
There's so much richness in there. There's so much, like, push and pull that he has to go through in this massive journey.
Right. And then the response of his parents, they raised him to be a good Amish person. And then he goes off to war. How do they respond to that?
Right.
Do they support him, or do they just shun him? Which he wouldn't be shunned officially by the church, but it's in the. We'll see what happens to him.
Yeah, I mean, there's always reason. There's so many reasons for that Amish will shun their different members. So yeah. Mm-hmm. So with what I was really interested in is that you've got this sort of, you've got the Amish romance, which is so popular, but then it's also this historical. And you talked earlier about how you will do your research while you're writing, but I'm sure you also do your research in advance. Was this story inspired by any real research that you found, or was it just sort of all these different composites and you kind of created this character?
Well, it started out with research because my husband went through a time where he really was interested in the Civil War history, and we were living in Kentucky at the time, so we had access to some Civil War battlefields, and he and I both read books, and we visited some battlefields, and I was also caught up in this history of this war that was so important in our country's history. And so one of the books that I found as I was looking for books to research for my first series was, it's called Amish, the Mennonites and Amish and the American Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And so I bought it, and I thought, there's got to be a story in here somewhere, and I was right. There was. There were only 2 or 3 Amish who were members of the church who fought in the war. And it wasn't very common for them to do that. But there were other people with Amish connections or Mennonite connections who did fight in the war. And their experiences is where I brought in some of the details for this story.
Mm-hmm. Jan, our time is almost up, but I wanted to, before I let you go, I was interested to know what you are currently watching, reading, and listening to.
Okay. I don't watch a lot of television, but I do watch movies.
Great.
And we love classic movies. So the last movie I watched was Casablanca.
Oh, that's a good one.
It was probably the 4th or 5th time I've seen it, but I caught details that I'd missed before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a fascinating movie, and I love it. What I'm reading right now is I read voraciously. I think every author should read widely and deeply.
Yes.
And so right now I'm in the middle of Mystery by Elizabeth Peters, where she wrote mysteries that take place in Egypt at the time when the Valley of the Kings was just being explored in the late 1800s. And her detective is named Amelia Peabody. So her stories are a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And next on my reading list is one of the Sackett series by Louis L'Amour. I love historical fiction.
Oh, look at
And
you
then
going from mystery to historic. Well, staying historical,
Yep.
but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Western, yeah. And then the next on my list after that is a new one by Jane Patrick called Everything She Didn't Say. And that one, I just received it in the mail, so that will be my next one after that. So I try to read 2 or 3 books a week.
Okay.
And I also read nonfiction as well as fiction.
What are you listening to? It could be podcasts, music, audiobooks.
I love cross stitch, and that's my addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Is counted cross stitch. And when I'm working on that, then I listen to an audiobook. Rather than, or if we're not watching a movie, I'll listen to an audiobook. And the one I'm listening to right now is The Return of the King by Tolkien.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah. It's, I used to read that series every fall.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I almost have it memorized, but I still love listening to it. It's so well written.
Yeah. And especially when you get a good narrator to read it,
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy to get lost in that.
Yes.
Well, that's great. Well, Jan, before I let you go, for our listeners, how can readers stay in touch with you and find out more about you?
Well, I have a website, www.jandrexler.com. And on my website, I have a little bit of everything. I have some Amish recipes. I have my biography there and all of my books with links to buy them.
Perfect.
And I also have a Contact Me. And if you send me an email, I will contact you. I will answer you. And you can also find me on Facebook and Twitter and Goodreads and BookBub. I'm on all those. And then also be sure to stop by REVELL, their website, my publisher's website. And I'm on there as well as the other REVELL authors.
Well, Jan Drexler, thank you so much for giving me time this morning. We're heading into a holiday weekend, so I know everybody's traveling and getting ready to go. But like Jan said, you can find her books on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and anywhere books are sold. And we're so excited about the launch of the Sound of Distant Thunder. It's coming out in September. Thank you so much, Jan, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Well, thank you very much. You too.
I'd like to extend my thanks again to Jan Drexler for joining me today. You can find The Sound of Distant Thunder anywhere books are sold. I'd also like to thank REVELL Books and Bethany House for their continued support of the podcast. We couldn't do this without them, so thank you so much. Make sure you stop by freshfiction.com to find out more about Jan and other REVELL and Bethany House authors. Hey guys, we have a second season, but we are still growing. So anything you can do to help us, if you've rated the podcast, push those 5 stars at the bottom of each of your apps, like us on Facebook, but also just subscribe, tell your friends, and share us. You can always find us on Twitter at Fresh Fiction, Instagram by following Fresh Fiction, and on Facebook. So until next time, happy reading.